The Psychology of Doing the Right Thing, Part 4, some academic studies. An obvious question is, what are these people like? Is there a personality factor which is to do with altruism, heroism, doing the right thing? And Milgram, as I've said earlier, was well aware that the people who refused were just as interesting as the people who complied, and spent some time looking at his records and trying to work out what was going on, certainly looking at the demographics, and came up with the conclusion that there is a complex personality basis to obedience and disobedience, but he didn't find it. And quite rightly, he says there probably isn't a single temperamental factor, and it's a mistake to confuse obedience or disobedience and action or not action in other cases, I think, with being kind or being cruel. A lot of the studies are retrospective studies on Holocaust helpers. There were a lot of these people alive in the second half of the 20th century, and they were interviewed and tested and compared with others. But it's worth remembering that even in this group, you've got a variety of actions, a variety of issues, probably a variety of people. So it's still quite a complicated picture. Nonetheless, some consistent factors did seem to come out. The best known study is by the Oliners, who talked to a large sample of helpers and rescuers, and also tried to match those against other people living in the same areas at the same time who had been bystanders who hadn't helped. They came up with the idea that there was an altruist personality, and it was mainly marked by extensivist relationships. That is, a sense that people were related to other people, the rest of humanity, not to particular groups, particular families, and so on. But they also pointed out that there were situational factors, the general social atmosphere of approval or disapproval, of oppression or support, as Gruninger noted on the Swiss border in 1938. Obviously, the level of risk makes a difference. People won't take completely hopeless risks. If the risk is fairly low, people are more likely to involve themselves and help. And also, very practically, available resources. If there is a route through which people can be helped to escape, then people are more likely to do something about it. Fagin, Jones and Bydlaski did a similar kind of study with different groups, different people, different control groups, and did a psychometric analysis which came up with these factors: social responsibility, altruistic moral reasoning, empathy and risk-taking, which seemed to mark out the helpers and rescuers. Well, that seems to fit fairly well with Oliner and Oliner. Social responsibility and empathy seems to fit with the extensivist relationships. Altruistic moral reasoning makes sense, and in very risky and sometimes desperately risky situations, a preference for risk-taking is something you would expect in the helpers. Fagin, Jones and Bydlaski, to some extent in contradiction to the Oliners, found that situational factors weren't so important. How much space people had to shelter people, whether they were in quiet, isolated places, and quite interestingly, whether or not they were living with their family didn't make much difference, given that helping escapers could expose their family to mortal risk to being killed. Geras looked at the demographics and came to the conclusion that things like gender and class and political affiliation didn't make very much difference. Nor did prior acquaintance with Jews, though other studies have suggested that having Jewish friends, starting by helping people that you knew and then maybe moving on to more general groups of fugitives made a difference. But fitting with what the other studies have found, a sense of belonging to humankind seemed to be important. Verisi and Yaish went back and looked at the Oliner and Oliner data and pointed out that rescuers were more likely to report being asked for help than non-rescuers. I think and they point out there's some circularity here. If you're a fugitive, asking for help is a very dangerous thing to do, and you will be very careful who you would ask. So people who have an inclination to be helpful, people who have a reputation for helping, are more likely to be helped. And so it's difficult to work out quite how that relationship is going. Nonetheless, it fits with what we know from the unresponsive bystander research, that if people are asked, they are more likely to do something and less likely to be unresponsive bystanders. Monroe and others interviewed some people in quite a fairly small sample, but in a lot of depth, and came to the conclusion that what was important was a sense of self-identity, the idea of the kind of people they were, the idea of how they fitted in with the rest of the world, perceiving oneself as at one with all mankind, or perhaps humankind. Again, that overlaps with what we've seen before, but they point out that if you identify yourself strongly in that way, it to some extent turns out not to be an issue. You'll see at the bottom of this quote, one cannot really act otherwise. There was no decision to make. I didn't really think about it. What else can I do? And those are things that they found people said quite repeatedly. Fagan-Jones went back and looked at the Oliners data for upbringing and family background, which you think might well have an effect, and they suggest that it did. Rescuers came from cohesive families with affectionate parents who valued inclusion, victim-centered and inductive discipline techniques, that is, getting people to look at the consequences of their behaviour and think through the implications of right doing and wrong doing and basing discipline on that, and people in the family who were unprejudiced, pro-social role models, whereas the bystanders family tended to be less like that on most of those dimensions. I think there are other personality factors to be considered. As I've said before, what people do at the time is often not seen as doing the right thing. It's often seen very much as doing the wrong thing. It could be illegal, antisocial, undermining decent society, and so on. And so people who are used to doing illegal and antisocial things, criminals and psychopaths, and are skilled at doing them, may be very effective in these situations. And we'll see a little bit about that in the next section. So criminality and psychopathy might be useful skills to have. Equally, those people who are completely guided by their own values, who are not socially responsive, who believe in their own logic and in behaving entirely logically and consistently, those maybe with autistic traits, may be quite good at resisting the social approval, the social guidelines that they're amongst, and doing what they think is the right thing, no matter what else anybody else thinks. Again, we may see some echoes of this later on. And people have certainly looked at the issue of psychopathy, the idea that good psychopaths can be powerful sources of good, and people who will do the right things in bad circumstances, as bad psychopaths aren't. Smith and al. came up with relationships of fearless dominance and impulsive antisociality, which are subscales of the psychopathy scale, fitting in with heroism and altruism, both in people who had background as rescuers, but also they got everyday samples to do a scale about positive and helpful and heroic things that they'd done, and related that to psychopathy scores. Fearless dominance and impulsive antisociality fit quite well with what you might expect from people who are going to stand up and do the right thing. However, other studies like Costello and al. Haven't given a very clear picture. There are small interrelationships between different factors, but certainly I came out from reading that paper quite confused about what was going on. It's not a clear picture yet. Going back to the last chapter of Zimbardo's The Lucifer Effect, he tries to set out some factors, personality factors, which will make people more likely to do the right thing in difficult circumstances. And here's his list. Zimbardo's language is sometimes a bit oblique, so it might be worth going through this and setting it out in everyday terms. By mindfulness, I don't think Zimbardo means meditation and transcendental awareness. He means just being aware of what's going on, catching on quickly. As Hugh Thompson, circling above Me Lie, realised that something was going wrong and that something needed to be done. As those people who started objecting early on in Milgram's study quickly caught on to the implications of what was happening, were more likely to resist a bit later. Hardiness accepting interpersonal conflict, I think it's pretty obvious from all that we've said so far. Doing the right thing is likely not to go down well. It's likely to produce difficulty and objections from other people. Whistleblowers are not popular within their organisations and so on, so you have to be prepared to face up to that. An extended time horizon means not giving up long-term aims for short-term convenience. It's not thinking, how can I get out of this, but thinking, what does this mean? What's it going to lead to? And focusing on the long-term consequences. Resisting rationalising inaction, I think, is very important, because I think that's something we all tend to do. Well, there's nothing I can do. I'm not sure what would be right, what's going to go wrong. I can't do anything now, but I might be able to get around to doing something later on. We find all kinds of reasons for stepping back from the challenge, and we should resist that rationalisation. Transcend anticipating negative consequences can be stated, I think, more simply in saying, realising this is going to turn out badly for you and being prepared to do it anyway. And we'll certainly see that in some of the later cases that we look at. So I'd like you to look at some of the examples from the last section. So Paul Rusesabagina here, and on the next screen, Joe Darby, who was the whistleblower at Abu Ghraib. And they're both talking about their motivations, and I've put Zimbardo's list along the bottom of the screen, so I invite you to compare what they say with his list and see if you can find any agreement.
So I didn't have any other motivation. I just took in people. I helped them. I was willing to do it, and I even didn't have time to think about all that. Because each and every second, each and every minute, every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it was hectic. It represented a danger. And I had to work very hard and very fast, always to avoid the disaster.
Traitor! These are tutti cockroaches!
Let me explain, sir. Please, wait.
Shoot them.
Of course, at a certain given time, I knew I was going to be killed. But I didn't take it that way. I thought that dying one day, we'll all die. But at least dying like without doing anything, to me, was a failure. That is why I had to fight up to the end.
It was as selfish an act to him as it was a selfless act, in that he could not have lived with himself, and he could not have, looked in the mirror and gone on knowing that he had left however many it was in his care at the hotel to perish at a time when he felt like he could have done more.
I took it as an obligation to help my neighbor, whether I know him or not. Because even if I do not know someone, why should he or she die? Why should she be killed? Is there any reason to take out someone's life?
When I listened to him talking, people ask him, did he consider himself a hero? And he says, no, I'm an ordinary man. That was my job to do that. That's what I had to do. And I think that's the strength of Paul, the inner moral courage, the desire to help this ordinary man is the strength of the character.
I was
Right, here's Joe Darby.
I felt it was not only the right thing to do, but it was my job. It was my duty as an MP to do this. And I've never thought anything more than I was just an MP doing my job. My job in the Army was to put people in prison for doing wrong, and that's what I did. I would have been very, very happy if these people would have been arrested, they would have been punished, and it would have ended there. My intention was just to see those involved punished. I didn't want it to get out. I didn't want it to become national news. I didn't want to be labeled a hero or a traitor. I didn't even want people to know who I was. I just wanted these people to be punished for the wrong they had done. And I wanted to be kept in-house. I wanted the Army, it was the Army's problem, and the Army was going to take care of it. And I love the Army. I wanted to see them punished, and I wanted to see justice done for what they had done wrong. That's why I turned them in, and that's all I wanted out of it. I don't see myself as either a hero or a traitor. I see myself as an MP who did his job and punished those who had broken the law. It was my burden to bear, and I had to do it.
Okay, I think Rusesabagini's account fits pretty well with Zimbardo's list, and there's the definite connection with the whole of humanity. Joe Darby's account is much simpler. His actions were simpler, but still corresponds pretty well. He doesn't say much about an extended time horizon. He was hoping that there wouldn't be a time horizon as far as he was concerned. People would be convicted and that would be it. So, in the next section, I'm going to move on, again, looking back at some of the examples that we've had and say some more general and impressionistic things about personality and give a final summary.